He left her pregnant and said the baby wasn't his, but she fought back and left the court in silence. The bathroom was dim, the only light coming from the early morning sun bleeding through the window blinds. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared down at the white plastic strip on the edge of the sink. It was the fourth test she had taken in 2 days, but the result was still the same, 2 clear, unwavering pink lines. Her heart raced with a strange mix of joy and fear. She had rehearsed this moment in her head countless times, how she would surprise her husband, how his eyes would light up, how they would cry and laugh and hold each other. But now, as she stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, a sense of unease began to creep in. She hadn't been able to reach him all morning. His phone went straight to voicemail. That evening, she waited for him at the dinner table, the pregnancy test hidden inside a small gift box wrapped with care. He walked in hours late, dropped his keys on the counter without greeting her, and went straight to the fridge for a beer. His eyes were tired, but not in a way that showed concern or interest, just distant. She handed him the box with a smile that faltered when he looked at it, confused. "What's this?" he asked dryly, shaking the box a little. "Open it," she said softly, watching his face closely. He peeled the wrapping slowly, lifted the lid, and froze. His expression didn't change. No smile. No shock. Just a blank stare before he muttered, "Are you serious?" And then, without waiting for her response, he walked away. In the days that followed, the silence between them grew louder than any argument they'd ever had. He stopped coming home for dinner. He no longer reached out to touch her belly or ask about the baby. He barely acknowledged the pregnancy at all. When she brought up baby names or doctor's appointments, he would nod absently, eyes fixed on his phone. One evening, when she tried to initiate a conversation about moving to a bigger apartment, he cut her off. "Can we not talk about this right now?" "I'm exhausted," he said, voice cold and final. She shrank back, pressing her hand protectively against her stomach as if shielding the tiny life inside from his indifference. At night, she lay awake next to a man who had become a stranger, listening to the rhythm of his breath, wondering how they had ended up here. Their marriage had been rocky at times, sure, but she thought the news of the baby would bring them closer, would spark something new. Instead, it felt like it had driven a wedge between them. He had started working late, taking business trips that didn't quite add up. She tried to believe him, but the growing distance told a different story. The connection they once had was unraveling, thread by painful thread, and she was left clutching the remnants of a relationship that seemed to be slipping away faster than she could hold on. A week later, they were invited to a dinner party hosted by a couple from his office. She didn't want to go. Her morning sickness had been intense that day, and her ankles were swollen, but he insisted. "It'll look bad if we don't show up," he said. So she put on her best dress, forced a smile, and tried to pretend everything was fine. The house was large and sterile, filled with laughter and people she didn't know. As they sat around the table, sipping wine and exchanging stories, someone made a joke about parenting, and she saw her moment. "Actually," she said, placing a hand on her belly, "we're expecting." The table went quiet for a moment, then polite congratulations followed. But her husband didn't smile. Instead, he rolled his eyes and chuckled darkly. "Yeah," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Wasn't exactly planned. But hey, surprises happen." The laughter around the table was nervous. She stared at him, stunned. "Excuse me?" she whispered. He took another sip and leaned back in his chair, his tone sharp. "Well, it's true. You basically ambushed me with it." The room fell into awkward silence. Her cheeks burned. She felt every pair of eyes on her, pity and confusion mixing in their glances. She stood up, trying to keep her composure, muttered a quiet "excuse me," and walked quickly to the bathroom, locking the door behind her before the first tear fell. The next morning, he was gone. No goodbye, no note, just silence. His side of the closet was empty, and a text message blinked on her phone: "I need space. Don't contact me for a while." Her breath caught in her throat. The nausea returned, not from pregnancy, but from panic. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone trembling in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. How could he disappear now, when she needed him the most? She called him over and over again, each time going straight to voicemail. She texted, pleaded, begged for a response, but there was nothing. The man who had once held her hand through life's storms had abandoned her in the middle of the biggest one. By the third day, she stopped calling. The silence had spoken louder than words ever could. Her parents came over, worried, confused, and full of questions she couldn't answer. They had never liked him, but even they didn't expect this level of cruelty. "What kind of man leaves his wife pregnant?" her father asked, his voice shaking with restrained anger. She had no reply. Her mother tried to console her, offering to let her move back home, but she refused. She needed to stay strong, not for him, not even for herself, but for the child growing inside her. Somewhere between grief and betrayal, a new resolve was forming. He could run if he wanted to. But this wasn't over. Weeks passed, and still no sign of him. Bills began piling up, and she started canceling every non-essential expense. Her maternity clothes came from secondhand stores, and she began skipping her usual prenatal yoga classes to save money. Yet, the greatest cost was emotional. Every time her phone buzzed, she hoped it would be him. Every knock at the door gave her a fleeting sense of hope, quickly crushed. Her nights were long and sleepless, filled with worry. Was he with someone else? Was he planning to return? Did he even care about the child they had created? She found herself drifting into dark thoughts, questioning her own worth, wondering if she had somehow pushed him away. Then came the letter from his attorney. A thick, cream-colored envelope slid through the mail slot one morning, addressed to her in cold, impersonal font. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was brief but devastating. He was filing for divorce. He wanted no responsibility for the child until a paternity test could be done. He claimed she had manipulated him, that the pregnancy was intentional, and that he had doubts about whether the baby was even his. Her breath caught in her throat. It was cruel, calculated, designed to humiliate her further. She stood in the kitchen holding the letter, her other hand protectively on her belly. And right there, something inside her snapped, not with despair, but with defiance. Sitting across from her parents in their modest living room, she felt like a child again, vulnerable and ashamed. Her mother stared at her with a look that held both worry and a sadness that words couldn't carry. Her father paced slowly, holding the divorce letter like it was some offensive document he wanted to burn. "We warned you about him," he said, not out of spite, but from the heartbreak of seeing his daughter suffer. She didn't defend her ex. There was nothing left to defend. The man she married had walked out on her and their unborn child, and now he was dragging her to court like she was some stranger trying to steal from him. Her mother, after a long silence, gently took her hand. "You are not alone. We'll help you through this, but you need to fight back." Her father stopped pacing and added, "He wants a war? Then you give him one. But do it with dignity. Do it smart. That was the first night she allowed herself to cry openly, not just for what she had lost, but for what she was about to face. With her parents' support grounding her, she finally felt the strength to move forward. No more waiting. No more hoping he would come back. The silence had turned into a battle cry, and she was ready to stand her ground. She sat across from a woman in a navy blue blazer whose eyes were sharp and filled with quiet fire. First of all, he can't legally walk away from a child he helped create. The court doesn't play favorites, but it won't look kindly on a man who abandons his pregnant wife, the lawyer said, flipping through pages of documents she had carefully prepared. The sound of the papers was almost soothing. For the first time in weeks, she felt like someone was on her side, not out of pity, but out of justice. "We'll file immediately. We'll request financial support, and yes, we'll demand a paternity test, but not because he asked for it. Because it will destroy his story." The woman nodded, holding back tears that threatened to spill. The attorney continued, "We will not just defend you. We will go on offense. He wants to humiliate you in court? Let's expose the real story behind his disappearance." Every word was fuel for a new fire burning inside her. She wasn't weak. She wasn't disposable. And she certainly wasn't alone. That meeting ended with her signing the first official documents, her name, strong and steady at the bottom of the page, sealing the beginning of her fight. It was more than paperwork. It was the moment she reclaimed her voice. A week later, another letter arrived. This time, it was longer and colder. It accused her of emotional manipulation, of entrapment, and even insinuated that she had timed the pregnancy to interfere with his career. It was an absurd claim, but the sting was real. The document suggested that he had serious doubts about the child's paternity and requested that she cease all attempts at financial compensation until proof was provided. She felt sick reading it, the carefully crafted words aiming not at her legal rights, but at her dignity. He hadn't just left her, he wanted to destroy her in court, erase his responsibility, and walk away untarnished. Her lawyer responded quickly, firmly, and with precision. "Let him try," she said, sliding her reply draft across the desk. It was more than a rebuttal, it was a statement of truth backed with legal teeth. "We'll submit medical records, witness accounts, and every timeline. And once the test confirms what we already know, his entire case will collapse." That night, the woman sat alone in her apartment, rereading the accusations until the paper blurred from her tears. But the fear she felt no longer controlled her. It had transformed into something sharper, something determined. If he wanted to drag her through court, she would make sure the world saw him for who he truly was. The official court notice came on a Tuesday morning, sealed and stamped. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing the date set for the preliminary hearing, 6 weeks from now. She had never stepped foot in a courtroom before, let alone for something as personal and raw as this. Her heart raced at the thought of standing in front of a judge, being questioned, being doubted. But then she remembered the way he had smirked when he left, the way he had dismissed her pregnancy like it was nothing but an inconvenience. That image burned itself into her mind and steeled her nerves. She spent the following days gathering everything she could, photos, emails, receipts from prenatal appointments. Her lawyer instructed her to document every detail. Meanwhile, he remained silent. No messages. No explanation. No apology. His absence was now his signature. The silence spoke volumes in the courtroom of public opinion, but what mattered now was the legal battlefield. As the date drew closer, she started preparing not just evidence, but herself. Her strength, once buried beneath heartbreak, was now beginning to rise. Not for revenge, but for justice, for her child, and for the dignity he tried to strip away. A few days before the hearing, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. "I'm not sure if you remember me. I used to work with your husband." The name sounded vaguely familiar, a woman she had seen only briefly at office parties, someone who had always smiled politely but never really engaged. "I know this is awkward, but I have something you need to hear." Her heart pounded. They agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, far from the judging eyes of mutual acquaintances. The woman arrived carrying a brown envelope, her face pale but determined. "I found this by accident. I don't want to be involved, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't show you." Inside the envelope were printed messages, screenshots, emails, even a voice memo. In them, her ex-husband spoke candidly to another colleague, bragging about how he planned to ditch the situation before it got messy, and joked that no court would force him to pay for something he didn't ask for. The woman across the table looked her in the eye. "He thinks he can play everyone. I just wanted you to know, you're not crazy. And you're definitely not alone." For the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the truth was finally beginning to surface. The coffee-stained envelope rested heavily on her lap as she scrolled through the screenshots again. Each message was like a dagger, every word confirming the betrayal she had tried so hard not to believe. Her ex-husband had been seeing another woman for months, long before he left. The messages didn't just reveal an affair. They exposed a strategy. He had planned to disappear, talked about ways to make her seem unstable in court, and even joked that pregnancy hormones would help him win sympathy if she broke down in front of the judge. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was calculated. She forwarded the documents to her lawyer immediately. The reply came within minutes. "This changes everything." The betrayal wasn't just marital, it was legal ammunition. They could now present intent to manipulate the court, which could influence custody and financial rulings. But even more than legal leverage, what she felt was vindication. The gaslighting, the silence, the cold accusations, it wasn't in her head. It was real. The truth was no longer buried beneath charm and lies. He had built a fortress of deceit, but now she held the keys to tear it down brick by brick. Court day arrived like a storm cloud that had been looming for weeks. She entered the courthouse in a modest navy dress, her rounded belly unmistakable beneath the fabric. Heads turned as she walked through the hall, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. At the end of the corridor, he stood beside his attorney, wearing a smirk that hadn't aged a day. He didn't look at her. Instead, he leaned in and whispered something to his lawyer, then let out a small laugh. The arrogance made her stomach turn. But she didn't flinch. Not this time. When the judge called for paternity testing, his side pushed eagerly, presenting it as their primary concern. Her lawyer nodded calmly, already prepared. "We consent. And we request that the test be expedited to minimize stress on the unborn child." The judge agreed. The next step would be handled privately at a clinic, but the implications were public. He was trying to buy time, to stall the process with the illusion of uncertainty. But she knew the truth, and soon, so would the court. As they left the room, he finally looked at her and said, low enough for only her to hear, "You're going to regret dragging this out." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. 2 weeks later, back in the same courtroom, her ex took the stand for preliminary questioning. His lawyer led him through a rehearsed narrative, how he had been blindsided by the pregnancy, how he had always wanted to do the right thing, but she had become emotionally unstable. It was a carefully crafted performance, and for a moment, she feared it might work. He painted himself as a confused man, overwhelmed and abandoned, forced to protect himself from a manipulative partner. Several people in the room nodded slightly, buying into the mask he wore. But then, her lawyer stood up, calm and unshaken, and began to play the voice recording. His voice filled the courtroom speakers, arrogant and smug. "She's not gonna touch a cent. I'll drag her through court till she gives up. If she cries, it'll just make me look better." The room fell silent. His face drained of color. The judge raised an eyebrow. Murmurs filled the back of the room, and his lawyer's face turned pale. He tried to speak, to explain, but the damage was done. She sat silently, head held high. The courtroom had just seen who he really was, and he knew it. The judge leaned forward, fingers clasped together, eyes locked on the man who now fidgeted in his seat like a cornered animal. "This court does not appreciate manipulation," she said, voice cool and deliberate. "Especially when it affects a mother's right to safety and security during pregnancy." His lawyer attempted to object, but the judge raised her hand and continued. "We will proceed with the full hearing, but let it be clear, credibility has been significantly compromised." His head dropped slightly. He wouldn't be smiling again today. Outside the courtroom, as reporters lingered near the steps, her attorney advised they avoid speaking to the press. She agreed, but not before glancing back through the glass doors. He was standing there, still surrounded by people, but utterly alone. His phone buzzed. She imagined the messages now flowing in, not in support, but in disbelief. The carefully curated image he had built was crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. And it wasn't over yet. The main hearing was still to come, and now the truth had momentum on its side. That night, as she lay on the couch with a warm compress on her swollen ankles, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old college friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. "Saw the news online. Is it really him?" Along with the message was a link to a small blog post someone had written about the courtroom recording, which had leaked and was beginning to circulate online. The post ended with a scathing paragraph. "When a man walks out on a pregnant woman and tries to play victim, he should remember, truth always finds a voice." It had already been shared hundreds of times. As she read the comments, something shifted inside her. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about her, her child, and the life they deserved, one built on truth, not silence. She responded to her friend with a simple message: "Yes, it's him. But I'm not the same woman I was back then." The phone buzzed again. Another message. Then another. The truth had been set free, and people were listening. And for the first time since he left, she felt something she thought had been lost forever: peace. 3 days before the next court appearance, her lawyer handed her a small black USB drive. "You're going to want to sit down before you watch this," she said. That night, alone in her apartment, the woman plugged the drive into her laptop and pressed play. A recording began, security footage from a corporate dinner, time-stamped a few weeks before he left. The camera showed him sitting beside the same woman who had leaked the messages. They were laughing, whispering. At one point, he leaned close and said, "Once I'm out, I'll finally be free. She can have the baby. I'm not paying for someone else's mistake." The words struck like a slap. Someone else's mistake. That's how he viewed her child. Not as his own, not as something sacred or shared, but as a burden he never wanted to carry. Her hands shook as she paused the video, bile rising in her throat. But then something unexpected happened. The camera caught the woman beside him reacting, recoiling, whispering something back. The audio wasn't clear, but her face showed disgust. It became obvious, even the woman he was seeing hadn't signed up for this level of cruelty. This wasn't just betrayal. It was abandonment of every kind, legal, emotional, and moral. The nights grew longer, sleep slipping away like fog through her fingers. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the courtroom, remembered his words, his smug expression during the recordings. The stress of the trial was beginning to show on her body. Her back ached more, her feet swelled faster, and her appetite disappeared. Yet she endured. Because now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a child who hadn't even taken their first breath yet. Every kick from within her belly reminded her why she couldn't fall apart. Her parents began spending more time at her apartment, bringing groceries, helping with laundry, rubbing her shoulders as she tried to rest. Their quiet support became her lifeline. One night, her mother sat beside her and whispered, "You're going to be such a strong mother. And one day, your child will know just how much you fought to give them dignity." The words anchored her. She would not crumble. Not now. Not when she was this close to reclaiming everything he tried to destroy. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the second hearing began. This time, more people filled the benches, local reporters, legal interns, even strangers who had followed the viral post online. Her ex looked nervous for the first time. His lawyer kept whispering instructions, but he no longer carried the confidence he once flaunted. When the judge entered, the room fell into a tense hush. The proceedings began swiftly. Her lawyer introduced the USB video into evidence. There was no objection. Not this time. Everyone had learned not to underestimate the woman who stood alone but never wavered. As the video played, the silence in the courtroom became suffocating. Her ex didn't look at the screen. He stared down at the table, lips pressed together. When the clip ended, the judge leaned back, visibly disturbed. This is not just abandonment. This is premeditated neglect. Her lawyer then presented medical documents, every appointment he had missed, every expense she had covered alone. With each page, the image of the innocent man he pretended to be crumbled. It wasn't just a legal loss, it was a moral defeat, and everyone in the room could see it. Outside the courtroom, a journalist handed her lawyer a printed packet of documents, anonymous, but credible. Inside were dozens of chat logs between her ex-husband and a private forum of men discussing how to exit unwanted fatherhood without financial consequences. Her name was never mentioned, but the timeline, details, and language aligned perfectly. In one message, he wrote, "If I push her far enough, she'll crack. That's when I'll offer her a settlement to walk away." It wasn't just about escape. It was about control. He wanted to break her spirit first. Her lawyer quickly filed a motion to include the chat logs as supporting evidence. Though the source was unofficial, the judge agreed to review them privately. The implications were damning. This was no longer just a messy divorce or disputed paternity. It was a case of deliberate psychological warfare. And for the first time, her ex seemed to grasp the full weight of what he had set in motion. As he left the courtroom that day, he didn't look at anyone. Not at her. Not at the judge. Not even at his own attorney. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. On the third day of hearings, her lawyer called the unexpected witness, the woman from the coffee shop. She stepped into the witness box with steady steps, her voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't know the full extent of what he was planning," she began. "But I knew enough to realize that someone had to speak up." She described the conversations she'd overheard, the casual cruelty, the rehearsed lies. He bragged about making her look unstable, about how easy it would be to twist the story in court. The room listened in silence as she spoke, not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone seeking truth. Her words weren't dramatic. They were honest. Raw. The kind of truth that couldn't be spun or dismissed. When she stepped down, the judge thanked her directly. "Courage isn't always loud," she said. "Sometimes it's one voice standing up when it's easier to stay silent." And for the first time in a long time, the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table allowed herself a small smile. The tide had fully turned, and this time, it wasn't going back. The sealed envelope arrived at the court registrar's office 2 days before the final hearing. Her lawyer opened it during their strategy meeting, and though they both knew what to expect, the confirmation still brought a wave of emotion. 99.9% probability of paternity, the document stated, irrefutable and final. The lawyer didn't gloat. She just slid the paper across the table and said, "This shuts the last door he was trying to hide behind." It wasn't just proof of fatherhood. It was the final nail in his fabricated defense. At home, she stared at the document again and again, as if each reading helped her believe it more deeply. This wasn't about forcing a man to be a father, it was about holding him accountable for the life he tried to deny. She gently placed a hand on her belly. "You've always been real," she whispered. "But now, the world can't deny you either." The fear of being seen as a liar, of being dismissed or ridiculed, vanished. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was standing tall in the truth. When court resumed, the judge called the room to order with a tone sharper than before. She reviewed the paternity results aloud, her voice echoing with finality. "The defendant is, without question, the biological father," she announced. Her ex didn't react, his face was pale, hands clenched tightly in his lap. "But more than paternity, this case has revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation, avoidance, and emotional harm," the judge continued. "This court takes that into full consideration in its ruling." She ordered full financial responsibility for prenatal and postnatal care, and assigned temporary child support with mandatory reevaluation after birth. More importantly, the judge issued a public reprimand. "You attempted to weaponize doubt and shame against a woman who carried your child," she said, looking directly at him. "This court rejects that behavior with the strongest disapproval." In that moment, it was no longer about financial justice, it was moral. His humiliation was no longer private. It was official, recorded, and undeniable. As they exited the courtroom, a commotion stirred by the entrance. A woman appeared, elegant, with sharp features and unmistakable discomfort in her eyes. It was his new partner, the one from the corporate dinner footage. She approached him with slow, deliberate steps. "I saw everything," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it sliced through the air like glass. "You lied to me. You made me part of your cruelty." He tried to speak, but she held up her hand. "Don't. I'm done." Then, with hundreds of eyes on her, she turned and walked away. The room fell into whispers, the courtroom staff pretending not to watch. He stood frozen, lips parted, as if he couldn't believe it was really happening. For a man who had built his image so carefully, the unraveling was brutal and public. One by one, every false support beam he'd relied on, her silence, the affair, the narrative of victimhood was collapsing. And now, there was no one left to shield him from the truth. After the hearing, the judge permitted one final statement from each side. Her lawyer gestured gently toward her, offering her the chance to speak if she wished. She stood slowly, the weight of months finally centered in her voice. "I didn't come here to punish him," she began. "I came to protect my child. I believed we were building a family. He chose something else. But I won't let his choice define who I become or what kind of mother I will be." Her ex's lawyer urged him to stay quiet, but he stood anyway. "She's making me out to be a monster," he said. The judge raised a hand again. "You had your chance to speak, in text, in voice recordings, in front of witnesses. What you're facing now isn't character assassination. It's consequence." He sat down, his eyes avoiding hers completely. In that final exchange, no gavel was needed to declare who had truly lost. With the final ruling delivered, the case was closed. The judge assigned full legal rights to the mother, with strict conditions for any future visitation or involvement from the father, subject to review after birth, and only under court supervision. "This court prioritizes the emotional safety of the child," she said firmly, "and will not place them in the care of someone who treated their existence as a burden." The courtroom stood still as the final signature was marked on the file. As she left the building, the cool wind brushed against her cheeks. Her parents waited at the bottom of the steps, eyes brimming with pride. There were no cameras, no crowd, just peace. She walked slowly, one hand on her belly, the other holding the file that symbolized everything she had survived. What began with abandonment had ended in dignity. What began in fear had become her victory, not because she defeated someone else, but because she never gave up on herself. Though she had avoided the media, her case had quietly gained traction. A journalist who had followed the proceedings wrote an op-ed titled "When the Truth is Carried in the Womb." It wasn't sensational, it was honest, empathetic, and centered around her dignity. The article painted her not as a victim, but as a woman who stood alone against fear and humiliation and refused to break. Soon, her inbox filled with messages, some from women in similar battles, others from strangers offering admiration and thanks. Outside the courthouse on the day the piece was published, a small group of reporters stood in the cold, waiting for a statement. She walked past them without a word, but one of them simply said, "You gave a lot of people courage today." She turned, nodded once, and walked on. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because her actions had spoken louder than anything she could have expressed in a soundbite. Her silence, this time, was power. Weeks later, an unexpected message appeared in her inbox. The name was unmistakable. Her ex. The tone was different now, flat, reserved, and pleading. He wrote that he wanted to be involved with the baby, that he had made mistakes and hoped for forgiveness. "I realize now how I handled things was wrong," he wrote, as if reflection could erase the damage already done. He didn't mention the trial, or the humiliation, or the child he had denied. Her reply was brief. "You will follow the court's orders. There will be no negotiation outside of what has been decided. My child deserves stability, not confusion." She never heard back. Perhaps he thought she would fold once the storm passed. But what he hadn't understood was that she was no longer trying to hold the relationship together. She had rebuilt her life without him, and there was no room left for the version of him who once tried to silence her. The birth came quietly, in the early hours of a spring morning. The delivery was long, but safe. When the baby was finally placed in her arms, she cried, not from pain or exhaustion, but from overwhelming love. In that small hospital room, with her mother beside her, she whispered to her child, "You were never a mistake. You were always the beginning of something beautiful." Every ache, every night she spent alone, every courtroom tear had led to this moment. She named her daughter Grace. Not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had gained, grace through the storm, through shame, through fear. Holding that tiny body against her chest, she no longer thought of her ex, or the courtroom, or the betrayal. There was only now. Only her. Only Grace. And a future that no longer belonged to fear. Nearly a year later, she attended a community leadership event focused on legal support for single mothers. She had been invited as a guest, but as the room filled, one of the speakers failed to arrive. The coordinator, in a pinch, asked her to step in. Nervously, she took the mic and told her story, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She didn't name names. She didn't seek sympathy. She spoke of resilience, choice, and rebuilding. After the applause faded, a woman approached her, holding a business card. "We're looking for someone with exactly your voice to lead an advocacy project. We'd be honored if you joined us." The offer was unexpected, but something inside her clicked. She could help other women find the strength to speak. She accepted the card, and with it, a door opened, not just for herself, but for all the women who had once stood where she stood. A year later, sitting behind a polished desk in a modest office dedicated to legal aid for mothers in distress, she reviewed a job application. The name stopped her. Her breath caught. Her ex-husband. He had applied for a support position at a partner firm, unaware of who reviewed incoming candidates. The irony was not lost on her. She didn't laugh. She didn't smirk. She simply read through the resume, noted the gaps in employment, and clicked decline. She didn't need vengeance. She didn't need an audience to watch him fall. Her life now was full, not of revenge, but of redemption. As she leaned back in her chair, the soft coo of her daughter echoed from the nearby playpen. Grace looked up and smiled. And with that one look, she knew she had already won, not in court, not in public, but where it mattered most, in the quiet triumph of a life rebuilt, loved, and lived with purpose.